Today I'm going to share with you three extremely haunting stories about people who witnessed death up close, and how those experiences completely altered their perspectives on what's possible in life. Before we dive in, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, you've come to the right place, because that's all we do here. We upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that appeals to you, please offer the like button some pistachio ice cream, but actually fill their cone with wasabi. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you never miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. Story 1. Late one night in 1870, a Harvard medical student named James Adams walked down a dark street toward the gate of a cemetery in the quiet town of Malden, Massachusetts. With him was his classmate William, carrying an unlit lantern. Once they reached the gate, they stopped to make sure nobody was watching, then helped each other climb over. On the other side, they took off running down the cemetery path. After about a minute, they reached the other side and stopped outside a brick mausoleum containing the remains of a man named Ephraim Gray, who had died 20 years earlier. For years, James and William had been hearing rumors about Ephraim. Many of their classmates had heard these stories too, and some genuinely believed they could be true. But tonight, James and William had sneaked into this mausoleum to prove once and for all that those rumors were false. According to local legend, when Ephraim was alive, 20 years ago, he'd been a very reclusive chemist living in a big house in town with just one servant. People passing by would always smell a pungent chemical scent coming from inside. The belief was that Ephraim was running strange experiments, trying to create a potion that would make him immortal. Clearly, his experiments had failed because Ephraim had died anyway. But when he passed, his servant made an unusual request to the mortician: don't embalm him. The servant claimed that while Ephraim's elixir hadn't succeeded in keeping him alive forever, it had made his physical body immortal, that it would never decay. This story became a local legend. Decades later, many people, especially Harvard Medical School students, either believed it might be true or at least pretended it could be, because it was fun to believe. But James, as much as he wanted to go along with it, logically knew there was simply no way any of it could be true. As a medical student, he understood that even the best embalming techniques only preserve a body for a few weeks at most. There was no way Ephraim's body, dead for 2 decades, wasn't just a pile of bones by now. Tonight, they were going to find out. James knelt in front of the mausoleum. William struck a match and lit the lantern, illuminating the sealed door with a padlock. James pulled out a small hammer and chisel and began working on the lock. Eventually, he popped it open, set it on the ground, and stood up. They pushed the door, which slowly swung open. James stepped inside first, William behind him with the lantern. The space was cold, musty, and claustrophobic, a brick room covered in cobwebs. On each side were large shelves holding caskets of Ephraim's relatives, each with a nameplate. They quickly found the right casket, got on either side, pulled it off the shelf, and placed it on the floor. William held up the lantern. They exchanged a look, then James opened the casket. What they saw inside was unbelievable. It was definitely Ephraim's body, but even though his clothing had decayed into stringy brown mush, Ephraim himself showed no signs of decomposition. His skin was white and smooth, pristine. He looked like he was just sleeping, like he could open his eyes at any moment. Spooked, they slammed the casket shut, sprinted out of the mausoleum, fled the cemetery, and pledged never to speak of this again. But for the next few months, James couldn't get the image of Ephraim's impossibly preserved body out of his head. He still didn't believe the rumors. He didn't think some potion had made the body immortal. But he read every chemistry book in Harvard's library and couldn't find a scientific explanation for what he'd seen. Meanwhile, James had another worry. The Malden police were investigating the break-in, and he was terrified of being caught. Desecrating a grave was a crime, and if he was arrested, he'd be expelled from medical school. But weeks turned into months, then years, and no police ever showed up. Nobody figured out he or William were involved. Over time, James moved on with his life, graduated, became a doctor, and mostly forgot about the Ephraim incident. Until 30 years later, in 1900. By then, James was in his 50s, a successful doctor with his own practice in Boston. One day, while catching up on paperwork, he heard a knock at the door. A police officer from Malden entered. The officer said he was looking into an unsolved break-in at the cemetery from 30 years earlier. James felt sick. He was about to deny everything when the officer said multiple people in town had already identified him and William as the culprits. Knowing he was caught, James explained why they'd done it. The rumors about Ephraim's body not decomposing, wanting to see for themselves. He swore they only opened the casket, looked, and ran. They didn't take anything. But the officer stared at him with narrowed eyes. Then he explained why they were reopening the case, after all these years. The Malden cemetery was being relocated, and workers were moving every grave. When they reached Ephraim Gray's casket, they noticed it was unusually light. Opening it, they found it empty. No body, no bones. There was no sign anyone besides James and William had ever tampered with the mausoleum. Now, James and William were being accused of stealing Ephraim's body. They both swore they hadn't, but police could find no evidence that anyone else had been involved. So where did the body go? It was almost as if Ephraim had simply woken up one day, looking as fresh as ever, opened his coffin, and walked out. Despite all their skepticism and medical training, James and William couldn't help but wonder maybe Ephraim's immortality potion had finally kicked in. Story 2. On the afternoon of January 28, 1945, an Australian reporter named Robert Cheney sat on a wooden bench inside a small, cramped room in a swelteringly hot church in Brazil. He was squeezed shoulder to shoulder with several other reporters and a few doctors in white coats. All the lights were off, and a religious hymn played on a phonograph, an early record player. On the other side of the room, in front of a heavy locked door, stood two psychic mediums, twisting and groaning as if in pain. The reason Robert and the others were gathered here was because of what was happening inside that locked room. A man was having his appendix removed. Normally, appendix removal was routine surgery performed in a hospital, not a church back room. But this operation was being performed by a very famous surgeon named Dr. Louis Gomes, who had agreed only under odd conditions. First, it had to be done in this church. Second, no one else could enter the operating room while he worked. No nurses, no anesthesiologists. Third, the only people Dr. Gomes would communicate with were the two mediums outside the door. They'd help prepare the room, strap the patient down, and gather supplies. Then they'd left and sealed the room. The witnesses had also boarded up the windows and searched for hidden passageways, ensuring no one could look in or sneak in or out. Eventually, everything was ready. Dr. Gomes and the patient were alone inside, sealed off and locked in. The witnesses took their seats and waited. Nothing happened. Just the hymn playing. The mediums doing strange things in front of the door, supposedly communicating with the doctor. The whole thing seemed absurd. Robert had come not to validate the procedure, but because it would make a wild story. But the longer he sat there, the more he felt like he'd bitten off more than he could chew. Overhearing the doctors talking, Robert learned they were skeptical. There was no way Dr. Gomes could perform this surgery, especially without anesthesia or nurses. The whole thing was unsettling. Then, suddenly, the medium stopped. The witnesses sat for another hour waiting. Finally, a booming voice came from the locked room, announcing the operation was over. The witnesses approached the door. The medium stepped aside, and one of the doctors tried the handle. It was unlocked. They opened the door and walked in. The patient lay on the table with fresh stitches on his side, and a jar containing his appendix floated in liquid beside him. The surgery had been a success. The patient was fine. But the surgeon, the famous Dr. Gomes, was nowhere to be seen. And the reason was that Dr. Gomes was dead. He died 19 years earlier. The organizers had brought witnesses because they knew nobody would believe it otherwise. Even though a dozen people swore no living doctor had entered or left that room, X-rays later confirmed the patient had indeed had his appendix removed by a highly skilled surgeon. To this day, it remains the only surgery on record officially performed by a ghost. Story 3 at 5:00 a.m. on December 5, 1957, a 74-year-old woman named Frances B. woke up in her bedroom near San Francisco. Before opening her eyes, she had a sense that someone else was in the room. She wasn't bothered. It must be her husband, Gene. He was 82 and had been sick for years, often sleeping in the guest room to avoid disturbing her, but he'd sometimes join her in the morning. However, when Frances opened her eyes, she saw it wasn't Gene. She was lying on her side, looking toward the floor, and the first thing she saw were very distinctive shoes. Old-fashioned polished dress shoes with thick heels, gray fabric buttoned over the ankles, like men wore in the late 1800s. Gene didn't own shoes like that. As her eyes traveled upward, she saw a small man in black and gray striped pants, a white vest, and a long black coat with coattails. When she reached his face, he had strikingly blue eyes, looking right at her with a mocking grin. A stranger was in her house. She sat up, and the man leaned forward, smiling, and said, "I'm here for Gene." Frances screamed. The little man laughed, and then vanished. Gene burst in asking what was wrong. Frances told him about the strange little man. But as she spoke, she realized how absurd it sounded. Gene didn't believe her. By the time she finished, Frances was starting to think maybe it had just been a vivid dream. Still, they checked the whole house. Nothing unusual, except the front door was unlocked, which Gene was sure he'd locked. By 7:00 a.m., Frances felt convinced it had been a nightmare. They resumed their routine, but Gene suddenly deteriorated rapidly. His doctor was called by 8:00 a.m., but Gene was already failing fast. He was rushed to the hospital, but by the next morning, he had died. Over time, Frances rationalized the experience. Maybe it was her mind's way of preparing for Gene's death, but she couldn't explain how her mind had created such a strange character with such specific clothing. She'd never seen anyone like that. She pushed the memory away. Months later, Frances and her 46-year-old daughter Jane were driving home from a road trip celebrating Gene's life. In the quiet car, Jane spoke up, saying something weird had happened on the morning June died. She'd seen a little man in strange shoes, striped pants, a black coat with coattails, and bright blue eyes standing in her room. He'd said, "I'm here for Jane." Frances couldn't believe it. She'd seen the exact same man, and he'd said, "I'm here for Gene." They compared notes, trying to make sense of it. Frances assumed Jane must have misheard. The man must have said, "Gene," not "Jane." They agreed that had to be the explanation. But on December 7th, 1958, exactly 1 year and 1 day after Gene's death, Jane died too. She'd had undetected cancer that had spread too far to treat. After Jane's death, Frances was overcome with grief, and began telling everyone about the strange little man. She even wrote to a journalist, desperate for answers. No one had a meaningful explanation. However, after describing the man's outfit in detail, Frances learned one piece of information that seemed to explain who he was. That outfit, old-fashioned dress shoes, striped pants, white vest, black coattails, is actually the uniform of a very specific profession. The little man with the blue eyes was dressed exactly like a 19th century undertaker. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. Remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. If you're looking for a recommendation from me of one video worth your time, it's this one right here. Give it a watch. All right, until next time. See you.